John Wesley never wanted to be a pastor. When he was a young man, it was clear that he had a staggering intellect. He went to Oxford University and he studied the Greek language, and he was so accomplished as an academic that when he graduated, he was invited to stay on as a professor. And that was all John Wesley ever really wanted to do. He wanted to stay at the university. He wanted to teach students the Greek language. He wanted to spend time in dusty libraries, reading the books of the New Testament in their original language. John Wesley could have very happily lived out his life as a professor of the Greek language at Oxford University, if not for a promise that he made to his father. John Wesley's father, Samuel, was a pastor in the Church of England. And as he was dying, as he was lying on his deathbed, John Wesley stood at his father's side. And Samuel looked up at John Wesley and said, "Son, make me a promise. Promise that you will follow in my footsteps. Promise me that after I am gone, you too will become a pastor. You too will enter into the ministry." Well, John Wesley couldn't say no to his father in that moment, and so he made the promise. He said, "Yes, after you are gone, I will follow in your footsteps." And John Wesley intended to honor that promise. After his father died, he left the university. He became not only a pastor, but a missionary. John Wesley figured if he was going to enter the ministry, then he might as well jump in with both feet. And so he traveled to the English colony of Georgia, where he intended to preach the gospel to the colonists and to the Native Americans who lived in that place. Even as he set off on this journey, there was a storm brewing in John Wesley's heart. He had a serious case of imposter syndrome. He was convinced that a pastor should have a deep and unshakable confidence in God. And John Wesley also knew that he didn't have it. He couldn't find that faith in his own heart. On his way to Georgia, the storm in his heart was matched by a terrible storm at sea. One day, on that long sea voyage, the wind and waves started to batter and toss the ship that was carrying John Wesley to the Americas. Even the seasoned sailors who crewed the ship were convinced that they were about to be lost at sea. As the storm grew more and more intense, John Wesley made his way down into the belly of the ship, and there he found an amazing sight. Gathered in the hold of the ship were a group of German settlers. They were part of a religious group called the Moravians. And even as the storm was raging around them, these Moravian German settlers were huddled together and they were singing psalms. They were singing calmly and peacefully songs of worship. Well, John Wesley was amazed at the calmness that he heard in their voices. He wondered, how is it that they are not afraid when we all seem to be about to die? Eventually the storm passed. The ship didn't sink. John Wesley made his way over to these settlers and he struck up a conversation. He said, "Why is it that you were not afraid? How is it that you were able to be so calm even as the storm was raging?" And these Moravian settlers looked at John Wesley and they said, "Well, it's simple. Living or dying, we trust in the Lord. Living or dying, our lives are in God's hands. Why should we be afraid?" Well, that made the storm in John Wesley's heart even more intense. When he looked at these Moravian settlers, he said, "This is what true faith looks like." And he was even more convinced than ever that he didn't have the kind of faith he needed in order to be a pastor. He arrived in Georgia and he spent a short, miserable, frustrating, unsuccessful time trying to do ministry in Georgia. And after a short amount of time in Georgia, John Wesley decided it was time just to go home. So he boarded a ship. He went back to England. He went to the city of London. And there in London, he was distraught. He felt like a sham. He considered leaving the ministry altogether. John Wesley was having a full-blown crisis of faith. One of his friends saw how much John Wesley was struggling, and he gave Wesley some good advice. "Preach faith until you have it," he said, "and then you will preach it because you have it." And so Wesley kept on preaching. He kept on preaching a faith that he didn't feel in his heart. And then something remarkable happened. One night, a friend dragged him to a Bible study at a home on Aldersgate Street. Wesley didn't want to go, but he went to humor his friend. That night, as the group read and talked about God's unbreakable love, John Wesley felt a stirring in his heart. He would later write in his journal that in that moment his heart was strangely warmed, and he realized that he did believe that Jesus had died for him, that God loved even him. Now, that wasn't the end of John Wesley's spiritual journey, but it was an important moment. In that Aldersgate experience, John Wesley felt a kind of peace, a stilling, a calming of the storm in his heart that he had never felt before. In many ways, the United Methodist Church is still a reflection of the faith of our founder, John Wesley. We believe that we are called to love the Lord our God with all our minds. We believe that God wants us to use our reason and our intellect. We don't ask anyone to check your brains at the door when you walk into a United Methodist Church. No other Protestant denomination has founded and supported more colleges and universities than Methodists have. Here in the state of Michigan, both Albion College and Adrian College were founded as Methodist schools. At the same time, we believe that the Christian faith is meant to warm our hearts. We believe that some experiences of God's love are beyond our human powers of understanding, and so we embrace mysteries, and we preach the gospel in a way that is meant to give peace and help people embark upon a lifelong journey of walking with Jesus. Methodist faith is meant to touch the head and the heart, both in equal measure.